The Gay Science, starting at chapter 15. From a distance. This mountain makes the landscape it dominates charming and significant in every way. Having said this to ourselves 100 times, we become so unreasonable and grateful that we suppose that whatever bestows so much charm must also be the most charming thing around, and we climb the mountain and are disappointed. Suddenly the mountain itself and the whole landscape around us, below us, have lost their magic. We had forgotten that some greatness, like some goodness, wants to be beheld only from a distance, and by all means only from below, not from above. Otherwise it makes no impression. Perhaps you know some people near you who must look at themselves only from a distance in order to find themselves at all tolerable or attractive and invigorating. Self-knowledge is strictly inadvisable for them. Over the footbridge. In our relations with people who are bashful about their feelings, we must be capable of dissimulation. They feel a sudden hatred against anyone who catches them in a tender, enthusiastic, or elevated feeling, as if he had seen their secrets. If you want to make them feel good at such moments, you have to make them laugh or voice some cold but witty sarcasm. Then their feeling freezes and they regain power over themselves. But I'm giving you the moral before telling you the story. There was a time in our lives when we were so close that nothing seemed to obstruct our friendship and brotherhood, and only a small footbridge separated us. Just as you were about to step on it, I asked you, "Do you want to cross the footbridge to me?" Immediately you did not want to anymore. And when I asked you again, you remained silent. Since then, mountains and torrential rivers and whatever separates and alienates have been cast between us. And even if we wanted to get together, we couldn't. But when you now think of that little footbridge, words fail you, and you sob and marvel. Finding motives for our poverty. There is no trick that enables us to turn a poor virtue into a rich and overflowing one. But we can reinterpret its poverty into a necessity, so that it no longer offends us when we see it, and we no longer sulk at fate on its account. This is what a wise gardener does when he places the poor little stream in his garden in the arms of a nymph, and thus finds a motive for its poverty. And who does not need nymphs as he does? The pride of classical antiquity. We lack the classical coloring of antiquity because our feelings no longer know the slaves of classical antiquity. A Greek of noble descent found such tremendous intermediary stages and such distance between his own height and that ultimate baseness that he could scarcely see the slavery clearly. Even Plato could not really see him anymore. It is different with us, who are accustomed to the doctrine of human equality, though not to equality itself. One who is not at his own disposal and who lacks leisure does not by any means seem contemptible to us for that reason. Perhaps too much that is slavish in this sense sticks to each of us, in accordance with the conditions of our social order and activities, which are utterly different from those of the ancients. The Greek philosophers went through life feeling secretly that they were far more slaves than one might think, meaning that everybody who was not a philosopher was a slave. Their pride overflowed at the thought that even the most powerful men on earth belonged among their slaves. This pride, too, is alien and impossible for us. Not even metaphorically does the word slave possess its full power for us. Evil. Examine the lives of the best and most fruitful people and peoples, and ask yourself whether a tree that is supposed to grow to a proud height can dispense with bad weather and storms, whether misfortune and external resistance, some kinds of hatred, jealousy, stubbornness, mistrust, hardness, avarice, and violence do not belong among the favorable conditions without which any great growth of virtue is scarcely possible. The poison of which weaker natures perish strengthens the strong, nor do they call it poison. The dignity of folly. A few millennia further along the road of the last century, and everything men do will exhibit the highest prudence. But that way, prudence will lose all its dignity. By then it will be necessary to be prudent. But it will also be so common and vulgar that a disgusted taste will experience this necessity as a vulgarity. And just as a tyranny of truth and science could increase esteem for the lie, a tyranny of prudence could spur the growth of a new kind of nobility. To be noble might then come to mean to entertain follies. To the teachers of selfishness. A man's virtues are called good depending on the consequences not for him, but for us and society. The praise of virtues has always been far from selfless, far from unegoistic. Otherwise, one would have had to notice that the virtues, like industriousness, obedience, chastity, filial piety, and justice, are usually harmful for those who possess them, being instincts that dominate them too violently and covetously, and resist the efforts of reason to keep them in balance with their other instincts. When you have a virtue, a real whole virtue, and not merely a mini instinct for some virtue, you are its victim. But your neighbor praises your virtue precisely on that account. One praises the industrious, even though they harm their eyesight, or the spontaneity and freshness of their spirit. One honors and feels sorry for the youth who has worked himself into the ground, because one thinks, for society as a whole, the loss of even the best individual is merely a small sacrifice. Too bad that such sacrifices are needed. But it would be far worse if the individual would think otherwise and consider his preservation and development more important than his work in the service of society. Thus, one feels sorry for the youth, not for his own sake, but because a devoted instrument, ruthless against itself, a so-called good man, has been lost to society by his death. Perhaps one gives some thought to the question of whether it would perhaps been more useful for society if he had been less ruthless against himself and had preserved himself longer. One admits that there would have been some advantage in that. But one considers the other advantage, that a sacrifice has been made, and that the attitude of the sacrificial attitude has once again been confirmed for all to see, greater and of more lasting significance. Thus, what is really praised when virtues are praised is first their instrumental nature, and secondly, the instinct in every virtue that refuses to be held in check by the overall advantage for the individual himself. In sum, the unreason in virtue that leads the individual to allow himself to be transformed into a mere function of the whole. The praise of virtue is a praise of something that is privately harmful. The praise of instincts that deprive a human being of his noblest selfishness and the strength for the highest autonomy. To be sure, for educational purposes, and to lead men to incorporate virtuous habits, one emphasizes the effects of virtue that make it appear as if virtue and private advantage were sisters. and some such relationship actually exists. Blindly raging industriousness, for example, this typical virtue of an instrument, is represented as a way to wealth and honor, and as the poison that best cures boredom and the passions. But one keeps silent about its dangers, its extreme dangerousness. That is how education always proceeds. One tries to condition an individual by various attractions and advantages to adopt a way of thinking and behaving that, once it has become a habit, instinct, and passion, will dominate him to his own ultimate disadvantage, but for the general good. How often I see that blindly raging industriousness does create wealth and reap honors, while at the same time depriving organs of their subtlety, which alone would make the enjoyment of wealth and honors possible. Also, that this chief antidote to boredom and the passions at the same time blunts the senses and leads the spirit to resist new attractions. The most industrious of all ages, ours, does not know how to make anything of all its industriousness and money, except always still more money and still more industriousness, for it requires more genius to spend than to acquire. Well, we shall have our grandchildren. If this education succeeds, then every virtue of an individual is a public utility and a private disadvantage, measured against the supreme private goal, probably some impoverishment of the spirit and the senses, or even a premature decline. Consider from this point of view, one by one, the virtues of obedience, chastity, filial piety, and justice. The praise of the selfless, the self-sacrificial and virtuous, that is, of those who do not apply their whole strength and reason to their own preservation, development, elevation, promotion, and the expansion of their power, but rather live in relation to themselves modestly and thoughtlessly, perhaps even with indifference or irony. This praise certainly was not born from the spirit of selflessness. The neighbor praises selflessness because it brings him advantages. If the neighbor himself were selfless in his thinking, he would repudiate this diminution of strength, this mutilation for his benefit. He would work against the development of such inclinations, and above all would manifest his selflessness by not calling it good. This indicates the fundamental contradiction in the morality that is very prestigious nowadays. The motives of this morality stand opposed to its principle. What this morality considers its proof is repudiated by its criterion of what is moral. In order not to contravene its own morality, the demand, "You shall renounce yourself and sacrifice yourself," could be laid down only by those who thus renounced their own advantage and perhaps brought about their own destruction through the demanded sacrifice of individuals. But as soon as the neighbor or society recommends altruism for the sake of its utility, it applies a contradictory principle. You shall seek your own advantage at the expense of everything else. And thus one preaches in the same breath, a thou shalt and thou shalt not. The order of the king for the day. The day begins. Let us begin to order for this day the business and the festivals of our most merciful master, who is still deigning to rest. His Majesty has had bad weather today. We shall be careful not to call it bad. We shall not speak of the weather, but we shall be a little more solemn about our business than would otherwise be necessary, and a little more festive about the festivals. Perhaps His Majesty will even be ill. At breakfast, we shall present the latest good news of the preceding evening, the arrival of Mr. Montaigne, who jokes so agreeably about his illness. He suffers from a stone. We shall receive a few persons. Persons? What would that puffed-up old frog say? Who will be among them if he heard this word? I am not a person, he would say, but always a substance itself. And this reception will take longer than anyone finds agreeable. That is enough to tell of the poet who wrote on his door, Whoever enters here honors me. Whoever does not pleases me. What a courteous way of expressing a discourtesy. And perhaps this poet is altogether right to be discourteous. It is said that his poems are better than the poet. Let him write many more then, and withdraw from the world as much as possible, which is, after all, the meaning of his civil incivility. Conversely, a prince is always worth more than his verse, even if... But what am I saying? While we are chatting and the whole court thinks that we are already at work racking our brains. There is no window in which anyone ever sees a light before ours. Listen, wasn't that the bell? Damn, the day and dance begin and we don't know the schedule. We have to improvise. All the world improvises this day. Let us proceed today as all the world does. At that, my strange morning dream vanished, probably a victim of the hard strokes of the tower clock which announced the 5th hour. With all of its accustomed gravity, it seems to me that on this occasion, the god of dreams was pleased to make fun of my habit of beginning the day by ordering it and making it tolerable for myself. And it is possible that I have sometimes done this too formally, as if I were a prince. The signs of corruption. Consider the following signs of those stages of society which are necessary from time to time and which are designated with the word corruption. As soon as corruption sets in anywhere, superstition becomes rank, and the previous common faith of a people becomes pale and powerless against it. For superstition is second-order free spirit. Those who surrender to it choose certain forms and formulas that they find congenial and permit themselves some freedom of choice. Whoever is superstitious is always, compared with a religious human being, much more of a person. And a superstitious society is one in which there are many individuals and much delight in individuality. In this perspective, superstition always appears as progress and as a sign that the intellect is becoming more independent and demands its rights. Those who complain of corruption are the adherents of the old religion and religiosity, and they have also determined linguistic usage hitherto, and have given superstition a bad reputation even among the freest spirits. Let us realize that it is actually a symptom of enlightenment. Second, a society in which corruption spreads is accused of exhaustion, and it is obvious that the esteem for war and the pleasure in war diminish, while the comforts of life are now desired just as ardently as warlike and athletic honors were formerly. But what is generally overlooked is that the ancient national energy and national passion that became gloriously visible in war and warlike games have now been transmuted into countless private passions and have merely become less visible. Indeed, in times of corruption, the power and force of the national energies that are expended are probably greater than ever, and the individual squanders them as lavishly as he could not have formerly when he was simply not yet rich enough. Thus, it is precisely in times of exhaustion that tragedy runs through houses and streets, that great love and great hatred are born, and that the flame of knowledge flares up into the sky. Third, it is usually said, as if one wanted to make up for the reproaches of superstition and exhaustion, that such times of corruption are gentler, and that cruelty declines drastically. compared with the older, stronger age that was more given to faith. But this praise I cannot accept any more than those reproaches. All I concede is that cruelty now becomes more refined, and that its older forms henceforth offend the new taste. But the art of wounding and torturing others with words and looks reaches its supreme development in times of corruption. It is only now that malice and the delight in malice are born. The men of corruption are witty and slanderous. They know the types of murder that require neither daggers nor assault. They also know that whatever is said well is believed. Fourth, when morals decay. Those men emerge that are called tyrants. They are the precursors and, as it were, the precocious harbingers of individuals. Only a little while later, this fruit of fruits hangs yellow and mellow from the tree of a people, and the tree existed only for the sake of these fruits. Once decay has reached its climax, along with the infighting of all sorts of tyrants, the Caesar always appears, the final tyrant who puts an end to the weary struggle for sole rule by putting weariness to work for himself. In this age, the individual is usually ripest, and culture, therefore, in its highest and most fruitful stage. But not for his sake, or on account of him, although the men of the highest culture like to flatter their Caesar by pretending to be his creation. But in truth, they merely need peace from outside, because they have enough unrest and work inside themselves. In these ages, bribery and treason reach their peak, for the love of the newly discovered ego is much more powerful than the love of the old, used-up fatherland, which has been touted to death. And a need to achieve some security from the terrifying ups and downs of fortune opens even nobler hands as soon as anyone who is powerful and rich shows that he is ready to pour gold into them. There is hardly any secure future left. One lives for today. And this state of the soul makes the game easy for all seducers. For one allows one to be seduced and bribed only for today, while reserving the future and one's virtue. Individuals, being truly in and for themselves, care, as is well known, more for the moment than do their opposites, the herdmen, for they consider themselves no less incalculable than the future. They also like to attach themselves to violent men because they credit themselves with the capacity for actions and for information that the mass of men would neither understand nor forgive, while a tyrant or Caesar understands the rights of the individual, even in his excess, and has a personal interest in advocating and even abetting a bolder, private morality. For he thinks of himself, and would like others to think of him, in the way Napoleon once expressed in his classical manner: I have the right to answer all accusations against me with an eternal, "That's me." I am apart from all the world and accept conditions from nobody. I demand subjection even to my fancies, and people should find it quite natural when I yield to this or that distraction. That is how Napoleon once replied to his wife when she had reason to question the marital fidelity of her husband. The times of corruption are those when the apples fall from the tree. I mean the individuals, for they carry the seeds of the future and are authors of the spiritual colonization and origin of new states and communities. Corruption is merely a nasty word for the autumn of a people,